She agreed to work as a servant, but never imagined she'd be bound to the most influential marquis in Aurendale, and that it would alter her destiny forever. Eldermere and Hawthorne Keep, Whitthorne County, Aurendale, year 1871. November. Rain hammered against the glass panes of the Maraway home, like bitter laments falling from a sorrowful sky. Gwen pulled the woolen shawl tighter over her shoulders, watching the droplets carve winding paths through the misted window. She didn't yet know that these would be the last serene moments of her 19-year-old life. The fragrance of lavender still lingered in the parlor when her father, Alaric Maraway, emerged from his study with a face as pale as carved limestone. In his trembling hands, a bundle of creased letters quivered like autumn leaves about to detach. "Gwen!" His voice carried a hollow echo, distant, as if rising from a cavern. She turned, and in that instant, she sensed something irreparable had fractured. Her father's eyes, once warm, now held a coldness that cut to her bones. Lady Evangeline Ravencroft, her aunt, reclined in a velvet armchair like a hawk poised to strike. "The deeds to the Rosewick estate have vanished," Alaric muttered, each word dropping like stones into still water, "and our rivals already know secrets only our family guarded." The silence that followed pressed down like a burial shroud. Gwen felt the earth sway beneath her feet, yet pride anchored her upright, like an oak enduring the storm. "Father, I would never—" "The evidence is undeniable, niece," Lady Evangeline interrupted, her tone sweet as venomed honey. "Your late-night outings, your whispered exchanges at the market, even your foreign schooling cast suspicion upon you." Gwen closed her eyes, feeling her world collapse like sand sculptures claimed by the tide. When she opened them, she saw only emptiness where her father's affection had once lived. His judgment came as a fatal whisper. She would depart at dawn, carrying only what could fit into a single case. Her name would be struck from the records as if she had never been born. That night, as she packed her meager belongings, Gwen clutched the sole photograph of her late mother to her chest. The faded image seemed to murmur that truth, like spring, always finds its bloom even in the harshest frost. Yet who could have foreseen that Mrs. Genevieve Carow, her mother's former governess, would arrive at first light like a guardian spirit, offering her employment at a distant fortress called Hawthorne Keep. Autumn had gilded the leaves of Whitthorne County when Gwen's carriage rattled down the cobbled road leading to Hawthorne. The sprawling Gothic manor rose stern and majestic among ancient elms, its towers reaching skyward like fingers pleading with forgotten gods. Above the main gates, the Whitthorne crest carved in marble displayed a rampant stag and a coiled ivy, symbols of power and endurance bound together in eternal accord. Gwen instinctively touched her mother's locket, sensing that fate was threading unseen patterns through her soul. Mr. Cedric Vaylor, the butler, received her with solemn courtesy. His silvering hair and gentle eyes stirred memories of the father who once loved her. Eloan Price, a maid with flushed cheeks and a timid smile, guided her through the dim corridors, where ancestral portraits whispered silent tales from another age. "His lordship waits in the library," Eloan murmured, nervously smoothing her apron. "Lord Adrian rarely welcomes strangers these days." Her words drifted like incense, and Gwen felt the weight of secrets lingering in the stone halls. The library unveiled itself as a cathedral of learning, shelves towering to the vaulted ceiling. The scent of old parchment and polished wood enveloped her like a familiar embrace. By the fire's flicker, a figure emerged. Lord Adrian Whitthorne stepped forward from shadow, his raven-black hair framing eyes of storm-gray depths. His attire was impeccably formal, but an air of melancholic grace softened his presence, striking Gwen like the delicate press of piano keys. Their gazes met in silence, and in that fragile instant, something ineffable stirred between them, subtle as the drift of roses in a breeze, potent as the moon tugging at the tides. "Miss Maraway," his voice resonated, low and musical, with a sorrowful timbre. "Mrs. Carow has spoken of your talents. This library needs order, and the orphans on the estate need guidance in their learning." Gwen inclined her head with poise, sensing that her true life was unfurling at last. She could not yet fathom that those storm-lit eyes would come to hold both her salvation and her gravest test. As twilight bled into amber and violet, she settled into the east tower chamber, where the window-framed fields stretching into endless dusk. For the first time in weeks, a fragile seed of hope broke through her sorrow. Yet unseen, a shadow slipped between the curtains of the main wing, and a pair of eyes watched her with dangerous hunger as the crescent moon rose over Hawthorne. Winter crept upon the estate like a silent intruder, glazing the gardens in crystal and frost. Gwen discovered her calling among the musty tomes, and the wide-eyed orphans who gathered for lessons. Their eager faces glowed when she wove stories of distant lands, her hands sketching invisible maps in firelit air. Eloan Price had become her confidant, bringing steaming cups of tea on bitter afternoons and murmuring tales of the household's past. Mrs. Helena Grimsby, the rosy-cheeked cook, spoiled Gwen with honeyed cakes that tasted of lost maternal warmth. It was while arranging medieval manuscripts that Gwen uncovered the letters. Concealed between the pages of an astronomy treatise, written in an elegant feminine hand, they bore the name of Lady Celine Whitthorne, Adrian's late wife. "Dear Margaret," they began, "my fears about Evangeline are mounting. She visits Frederick far too often, and whispers of inheritance and hidden documents drift through the halls. Adrian dismisses my concerns, but a wife knows when peril encircles her home." Gwen's hands shook as she read. Lady Evangeline, her own aunt. A cold dread slid down her spine, deeper than any winter chill. That very afternoon, wandering the snow-blanketed gardens to steady her thoughts, Gwen nearly collided with Lord Adrian near the withered rose beds. He carried a bundle of white blooms. Celine's favorites, Eloan had once whispered. "Forgive me, my lord," Gwen murmured, bowing her head. But Adrian watched her with an intensity that sent Gwen's pulse racing. There was such profound sorrow in him that she felt the impulse to reach out, to offer comfort her voice dared not reveal. "Miss Marroway." "Gwen." His tone had shifted, softer, nearer. "I've seen your work with the children. There's something within you, a brightness this house has not known in many years." They walked together in silence, their boots carving parallel prints across untouched snow. Gwen felt torn between the warmth of his nearness and the dread of the secrets she now carried. Should she confess what she had discovered in Celine's letters? Could she truly trust him? When they reached the wrought iron gate bordering the gardens, Adrian paused, turning toward her. For a fleeting instant, it seemed he would speak words that might alter everything between them. But then, like clouds eclipsing the sun, his expression closed once more. "Good afternoon, Miss Marroway," he said with formal restraint before striding away. Gwen stood alone among the skeletal roses, clutching Celine's letters to her chest as if they were glowing coals. The winter wind sighed through the branches, carrying omens she did not yet know how to read. That night, as candlelight flickered in her tower chamber, Gwen resolved to keep her discovery secret until she grasped its full weight. She had no idea Lady Evangeline was already planning her arrival at Hawthorne, nor that her brief peace was trickling away like sand through a narrowing glass. The December fog draped Hawthorne keep in mystery when Lady Evangeline Ravencroft swept in, her ornate carriage gleaming. She proclaimed the intent to host a grand winter gathering. Gwen watched from the library window as her aunt descended with theatrical flourish, her sapphire silks blazing against the estate's somber austerity. "My dear Adrian," her voice rang through the entrance hall like clinking crystal, "this house must breathe again. Celine would despair to see you wasting away like this." Gwen drew back from the glass, heart quickening. Her aunt's nearness carried the same menace as storm clouds blotting out a calm harbor. In the days that followed, the mansion buzzed with frenzied activity. Florists arrived from Eldermere with ivory camellias and winter roses. Seamstresses occupied the east wing, stitching elaborate decorations. Gwen retreated to the library, yet she could not evade her aunt's piercing glances. "My dear niece," Lady Evangeline appeared one afternoon among the shelves, her gloved fingers gliding along the bindings. "What fortune to find you here. I trust you are not embarrassing the Marquis." The sweetness in her voice was venom wrapped in silk, and Gwen shivered. But she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "I serve faithfully, Aunt. Lord Adrian has shown me nothing but propriety." "Ah, but propriety is seldom sufficient, is it?" Evangeline smiled like a serpent about to strike. "Widowers are fragile creatures. How tragic it would be if someone sought to exploit his grief." On the night of the ball, Hawthorne glittered like a dreamscape. Crystal chandeliers painted rainbows on the walls, and the fragrance of gardenias mingled with the perfumes of the assembled aristocracy of Whitthorne. Gwen, clad in a modest gray wool dress, lingered by the servants' staircase, watching nobles move in graceful arcs across the ballroom. Adrian, flawless in his evening attire, greeted ladies presented by Evangeline, yet Gwen noticed how his gaze sidestepped hers, as though longing and fear warred within him. Then during the waltz, the facade collapsed. Evangeline, radiant in embroidered taffeta, raised her voice above the music. "I must inform our distinguished company of a troubling presence among us. Miss Gwen Marroway was expelled from her home for theft and for luring masters astray." I dare say our beloved Celine would writhe in her grave to know such a creature profanes her household. The silence was shattering. Every gaze stabbed at Gwen like sharpened steel. Tears seared her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Dignity was her final shield. And then the unexpected. Adrian strode toward the staircase, ascended a few steps, and extended his arm. "Miss Marroway," his voice rang clear, resolute, "will you grant me this dance?" The hall seemed to freeze in one collective breath. Gwen met his storm-gray eyes and glimpsed something deeper than courtesy, something perilous and profound. As they descended together, and he led her into the circle of dancers, every turn of the waltz became a wordless confession. The whispers of guests faded into the symphony. She heard only the racing rhythm of her own heart. "Pay them no mind," Adrian murmured, his breath grazing her ear. "You are worth more than all of them combined." But when the music ebbed, and he escorted her to the doors, Gwen caught the glint in Evangeline's eyes, dark, vengeful. This battle was only beginning, and the next strike would cut far deeper. The fire erupted in the early hours of January, snow cloaking Hawthorne like a deceptive veil of innocence. Gwen awoke to acrid smoke curling into her chamber. Through the window, she saw flames clawing the east wing, where the Whitthorne family archives were stored. Without hesitation, she threw on her robe and dashed into the corridors. The inferno devoured parchment and timber with hungry force, but Gwen noticed the flames licked most fiercely at the records concerning Celine and Adrian's inheritances. "What are you doing here?" Adrian appeared, his face lit by fire's fury. His eyes carried desperation as he watched decades of family history reduced to cinders. "There's something I must preserve." Gwen plunged into the smoke, ignoring the searing heat that scorched her skin. She sifted frantically through charred documents, until a muffled cry froze her in place. In an adjoining chamber, little Miriam, one of the orphans from her lessons, cowered behind a chair, paralyzed with fear. Gwen didn't hesitate. She gathered the girl into her arms, snatched a bundle of salvageable records, and fled to the gardens. Adrian received them, eyes ablaze with both admiration and something far more dangerous. "You risked everything," he whispered, his hand brushing her cheek as though to assure himself she was whole. "Why?" Gwen stood mute, for how could she explain that she would risk far more than her life, for him, and for the innocent children who trusted her? Little Miriam clung to her neck, sobbing softly. Later, when the estate men subdued the fire, Gwen sifted through the rescued papers. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. Correspondences from Frederick Ravenscroft, Evangeline's brother, to Lady Celine. They discussed the inheritance of Hawthorne, hinting at other methods if she resisted. One letter in particular left Gwen breathless. "Celine has grown too willful. Her suspicions of our designs sharpen daily. Perhaps the time has come to hasten our plan. A carefully arranged accident would solve every obstacle." Gwen closed her eyes, the dreadful weight of the truth crushing her chest. Lady Celine's death had never been misfortune. It was deliberate, orchestrated murder. And now, her very presence at Hawthorne threatened to uncover that terrible secret. When she laid the letters before Adrian the following morning, silence gripped him for long minutes. His hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the storm beneath his composed face. The anguish in his eyes was so raw that Gwen longed to embrace him, to share the burden he had borne alone. "I always suspected," he rasped finally, his voice rough as gravel. "Celine was so frightened in those last weeks. She spoke of fleeing to Eldermere, of carrying her evidence to a solicitor. I dismissed it as the anxieties of a woman expecting." Expecting? Gwen felt the floor tilt beneath her. 3 months. Adrian shut his eyes, grief threading every syllable. She was carrying my heir when the carriage plunged into the ravine. In that moment, Gwen grasped the magnitude of the crime. Not only Celine had been slain, but also the unborn child who would have secured the Whitthorne line and threatened the Ravenscrofts' inheritance schemes. Neither of them realized a shadow lurked behind the library drapery, absorbing every word, already plotting the next devastating strike. Spring crept timidly across Whitthorne, yet with it came a tension that hovered over Hawthorne like a low fog. Gwen felt unseen eyes on her each moment, when she spoke with Adrian, when they walked in silence, when she dared to smile. Lady Evangeline had claimed one of the grand suites, insisting that the Aurendale social season had grown intolerably dull. Her presence turned the manor's tranquility into a nest of whispers and shifting shadows. "My dear Gwen," she appeared one afternoon while Gwen sorted natural history volumes, "I've noticed a troubling intimacy between you and Adrian. As your aunt, I feel obliged to caution you against fostering inappropriate illusions. Something in Evangeline's gaze made Gwen recoil instinctively, like prey sensing its predator. Still, she composed herself, answering evenly. I assure you, Aunt, my relationship with his lordship is strictly professional. Ah, but hearts are treacherous things, aren't they? Evangeline trailed her gloved fingers along the spines with studied nonchalance. And widowers are particularly susceptible to misplaced consolations. That same evening at dinner, Gwen observed how her aunt steered the conversation with masterful cruelty toward the grandeur of Aurendale balls, the advantages of aristocratic unions, the sanctity of bloodlines. Each phrase was a razor, slicing away at Gwen's place in Adrian's world. Celine often said Hawthorne deserved a mistress worthy of its legacy. Evangeline remarked with feigned innocence, while Adrian poured his wine in silence. Someone who understood the duties bound to ancient titles. Gwen lowered her gaze to her soup, but each word struck like an icy slap. Adrian, meanwhile, seemed distant, his thoughts a mystery she could not reach. The following morning, the blow fell. Eloan Price burst into Gwen's chamber, her hands trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. Miss Gwen, say it isn't true, she sobbed, holding a bundle swaddled in linen. When the fabric fell away, Gwen's breath left her body. Lady Celine's diamond brooch, her most cherished possession, lay gleaming in Eloan's hands. Where did you find this? Gwen whispered, barely audible. Lady Evangeline discovered it, in your dresser, Eloan cried openly. She's already summoned Mr. Vaylor. Oh, Miss Gwen, they claim you've stolen from the very memory of the late Lady Celine. The chamber spun. The cruelty was precise, undeniable. It was not simple theft she was accused of, but sacrilege against the dead, an offense society would never pardon. When Adrian appeared at the doorway, Gwen saw trust die in his storm-gray eyes. Pain, betrayal, a cold distance that pierced her like a sharpened blade. Miss Marroway, his voice was formal once again, remote as winter stars. I must ask you to accompany me to the study. There are matters we must address. With all the dignity she could summon, Gwen rose. She knew protest was futile. The trap had been set with diabolical precision. Yet in her emerald eyes still burned an untamed flame, the innocence no slander could smother. As she walked the corridors for what might be the final time, Gwen carried the bitter certainty that Evangeline had at last achieved her goal. Her total ruin, even if it meant wielding the memory of the dead as a weapon. But there was one thing Evangeline had not foreseen. That dawn, Eloan had glimpsed a furtive shadow in the halls, a figure she recognized, though fear had chained her silence until now. The local prison at Eldermere was a damp stone fortress reeking of despair. Gwen spent 3 days in a frigid cell, sustained only by the fragile hope that truth might yet break through. On the third afternoon, Eloan appeared, her eyes raw from weeping, clutching a basket of bread and a secret that could shift everything. Miss Gwen, she whispered at the bars, glancing nervously about. That night, I saw Lady Evangeline leave your room, at 2 a.m. She carried something small, wrapped in cloth. When they found the brooch, I knew at once, but I was too afraid to accuse her. At that same moment, back at Hawthorne, Adrian roamed the gardens in torment. The investigator he had hired, Mr. Alaric Hartwell, had returned with revelations that shook his world to its foundations. Lord Adrian, Hartwell said, flipping through his notes, the evidence is damning. Lady Evangeline and her brother Frederick are drowning in debt. The Whitthorne inheritance would save them from ruin. Go on. Adrian's tone was dry as withered leaves. There is more. I located the original coachman meant to drive Lady Celine's carriage that day. He was dismissed that very morning and replaced by an unfamiliar man who vanished afterward. The dismissed coachman is willing to testify, if granted protection. That evening, Adrian confronted Evangeline. She lounged in the music room, idly striking the keys Celine once played. Ah, dear Adrian, she purred without turning. I presume you've come about your protégé's trial? The evidence is damning, Evangeline. His voice rang with chilling command. I know what you did to Celine, and I know Gwen is innocent. Evangeline turned slowly, revealing eyes gleaming with unmasked malice. All courtesy was stripped away, only raw cruelty remained. Celine was obstinate, she replied, calm and venomous. She uncovered our financial dealings, threatened exposure. And that child, curse it, that child would have secured her forever. You confess, Adrian murmured, horror etched in every word. You confess to murdering my wife and my child. I confess to solving a problem. Evangeline rose, terrible in her poise. And now I solve another. Gwen Marroway will hang for theft and profanation. You will wed a woman of my choosing, and Hawthorne will remain under my command. But Evangeline had underestimated a man who had already lost all and now possessed the truth. Adrian had already dispatched the evidence to the magistrates. The witnesses were secured. The next morning, when officers arrived at Hawthorne to arrest Lady Evangeline, she attempted one final desperate ploy. She declared that Gwen had blackmailed her, that everything had been orchestrated by the young woman to ensnare Adrian's heart. But the evidence was overwhelming now: Frederick's letters, the coachman's testimony, Aloan Price's sworn account. One by one, her lies disintegrated like sandcastles washed by the tide of justice as Lady Evangeline was led away in irons. Her gaze locked with Gwen, who had been released and now waited at the great doors of Hawthorne. In Evangeline's eyes burned a dark vow of vengeance, but also the bitter acknowledgement of a gambler who had wagered everything and lost. Gwen, in turn, felt strangely hollow. Justice had prevailed, but the cost in suffering and suspicion seemed unbearably high. She turned to Adrian, who approached slowly. In his storm-gray eyes she saw a silent question, one she still did not know if she could answer. The Eldermere courthouse had never witnessed such a spectacle. Lady Evangeline Ravencroft, once the embodiment of aristocratic refinement, now sat in the dock with a face pale as stone and the hollow gaze of someone whose schemes had collapsed. Gwen sat in the front row, not as the accused, but as a witness to justice. At her side, Adrian sat rigid, yet she could feel the heat of his tension like a forge burning beside her. The judge, Lord Pembrokhurst, a white-haired man with eyes as sharp as glass, read the verdict in solemn tones. Lady Evangeline Ravencroft, for conspiracy to murder, premeditated murder, and attempted destruction of evidence, you are sentenced to life imprisonment. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Gwen closed her eyes, feeling a strange mingling of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, yet so many lives lay broken in its wake. As they left the courthouse, Adrian paused on the marble steps and turned to her. The afternoon sun gilded her hair, casting a fragile light across the vulnerability in his eyes. "Gwen," his voice trembled, softer than she had ever heard. "There is something I must tell you, something I should have spoken long ago." She waited in silence, her heart thrumming like a hummingbird's wings. Around them, the city flowed with movement, but in that instant there existed only the two of them and the unspoken truth suspended between. "During these cruel months, when I doubted you, when suspicion poisoned everything, I discovered something undeniable." He stepped closer, and Gwen saw tears he struggled to contain. "I discovered that I had fallen hopelessly in love with you." The world seemed to halt. Gwen's knees weakened, her strength nearly vanishing. "Adrian," she whispered, but he pressed on, words tumbling like water from a burst dam. "I know I am haunted by ghosts. I know the gulf between our stations is vast. But," he raised his voice so all gathered in the courtyard could hear, "Gwen Marroway, will you marry me?" A stunned silence followed. Passers-by froze. Coachmen hushed their chatter. Even the sparrows seemed to hold their song. Are you certain?" Gwen murmured, tears spilling freely at last. "After all we have endured, after every doubt, I am sure of this. You are the bravest, most honorable, and purest soul I have ever known." Adrian took her hands, pressing reverent kisses to her palms. "I am certain Celine herself would bless our union, for you have saved not only my life, but my spirit." Gwen gazed into his eyes and saw not only love, but redemption. A future where pain might be reshaped into hope, where two wounded hearts might heal as one. "Yes," she answered, her voice clear as ringing crystal. "Yes, I will marry you." The kiss they shared upon the courthouse steps became legend in Whitthorne. It was said no act of love had ever been so pure, so fearless of convention, so radiant in its simplicity. 3 weeks later, in a modest ceremony within Hawthorne's chapel, Gwen Marroway became Lady Gwen Whitthorne. She wore her mother's wedding gown, lovingly altered by Aloan Price. Adrian shone with joy, as though years of grief had been washed from him. The orphan children sat in the front rows, eyes glowing with delight. Mr. Cedric Vaylor wept discreetly, while Mrs. Helena Grimsby prepared a feast fit for nobility. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Gwen felt she was binding herself not only to Adrian, but to a new name, a new future, a new destiny. Yet in the shadows of her damp cell, Lady Evangeline was already weaving darker designs, her thirst for vengeance reaching beyond prison walls. The summer of 1872 brought Hawthorne a serenity it had not known in years. Gwen, now Lady Whitthorne, gradually remade the estate into a true home. Corridors rang once more with children's laughter. Gardens flourished beneath her careful hand. Adrian seemed reborn with each passing season. In the mornings, Gwen often strolled among the roses in a lace shawl, admiring the coral and ivory blooms she had planted in spring. Adrian frequently joined her, and together they dreamed aloud of the improvements they would bring to the estate. "The village children need greater schooling," Gwen remarked one day, pausing at the rose garden where their story had begun. "I thought of expanding lessons, perhaps building a small schoolhouse near the property." Adrian smiled, that rare smile she cherished like a precious jewel. "You cannot cease caring for others, can you? It is one of the things I most adore in you." She blushed gently, still shy under his open affection, even months into marriage. That afternoon, while sorting correspondence in the library, Gwen found a letter that froze her blood. It was from Mr. Alaric Hartwell, the investigator, reporting that Lady Evangeline had died in prison under mysterious circumstances. Beside her, they had discovered an unfinished letter addressed to Confederates in Aurendale, detailing plans for the final ruin of the Whitthornes. Gwen quickly concealed the note as she heard footsteps. Adrian entered, carrying legal documents, his face lit with quiet triumph. "Gwen, I have news," he said, placing the bundle upon the table. "I've recovered every property Frederick and Evangeline sought to claim. Hawthorne is finally free of their grasp." She forced a tender smile, unwilling to dim his joy with the shadows of troubling letters. "That is wonderful, my love. Now we can bring all our plans for the children to life." That evening, as they dined in the intimate chamber Gwen had transformed into a haven, she gathered her courage to speak a truth she had kept close for weeks. "Adrian," she began nervously, her fingers toying with her mother's locket, "there is something you must know." He looked up instantly, attuned to the change in her tone. "What is it, my dearest? You've seemed different these past days." Gwen drew a deep breath, torn between joy and trembling fear. "I am expecting a child," she said softly, watching the words take shape in his mind. For long moments, silence reigned. Adrian remained motionless, absorbing the weight of her revelation. Then, slowly, a smile dawned upon his face, bright as sunrise after the longest night. "A child," he repeated in awe. "Our child." He rose, kneeling at her side, clasping her hands with reverence. "You have given me everything, Gwen," he murmured, pressing fervent kisses to her palms. "You have restored my ability to love, breathed life back into this house. And now you give me the miracle of a new generation." Tears of joy burned in Gwen's eyes. With Adrian kneeling before her, the promise of new life stirring in her womb, she felt that every past sorrow had been worth enduring. Yet outside, in the garden shadows, a figure watched from the lit window. Lady Evangeline's associates in Aurendale had not forgotten the Whitthornes, and dark schemes were already set in motion. Gwen and Adrian's happiness would soon be tested again, but this time they would face the storms together, like trees with entwined roots resisting the fiercest gales. Autumn came early to Hawthorne that year of 1872, gilding the leaves with melancholy gold, and bringing with it unwelcome visitors. Gwen, now 6 months pregnant, felt both radiant and fragile, like a blossom struggling to bloom in hostile weather. One gray afternoon, as she oversaw the orphans' lessons in the library, now a makeshift schoolroom, Mr. Cedric Vaylor entered, worry etched across his features. "Lady Gwen," he said quietly, "2 gentlemen from Aurendale have arrived seeking an audience with his lordship. They claim to represent legal matters tied to the Ravenscroft estate." A chill coursed through her. Since Lady Evangeline's death in prison, she had prayed the past would finally rest, but shadows had a way of surviving. The 2 men waiting in the drawing room radiated menace. Mr. Cornelius Blackthorne was gaunt, his pinched eyes calculating every detail of the room as though assigning value. His companion, Mr. Augustus Grimby, was rounder, his oily smile never reaching his gaze. "Lady Whitthorne," Blackthorne drawled, voice thick with false courtesy, "we grieve the misfortune of Lady Evangeline. We were her financial consultants in Aurendale." Gwen stood firm, one hand instinctively guarding her rounded belly. "Gentlemen, I believe there are no unsettled matters between our family and the Ravenscrofts. All judgments have been settled by the courts." "Ah, but there are obligations," Grimby said smoothly, producing a leather folder. "Contracts signed by the late Lady Evangeline, granting rights to certain Whitthorne properties as collateral for considerable loans." Gwen's hands trembled slightly. "Which properties?" "Hawthorne Keep," Blackthorne replied with thin satisfaction, "and the wealth attached to its title. Lady Evangeline gambled everything on an overseas venture, which, alas, failed." At that moment, Adrian entered, warned by Mr. Vaylor. His presence altered the air instantly, like a wolf stepping into a den of carrion beasts. "Gentlemen," his voice rang with steel. "Explain yourselves." The pair exchanged nervous glances but pressed forward, presenting documents they claimed proved Lady Evangeline had mortgaged Hawthorne for speculative trade. "Of course," Grimby added with false pity, "we recognize the delicate nature of the matter, especially considering her ladyship's condition. We would be willing to negotiate reasonable repayment terms." Adrian studied the papers with an unyielding eye. Gwen watched his jaw tighten, his gaze narrowing. It was the same look he'd worn when he uncovered the truth of Celine's murder. "Curious," Adrian said at last, returning the documents. "Curious, because Lady Evangeline had no legal authority to pledge Hawthorne. The estate has belonged solely to the Whitthorne line for centuries, unconnected to Ravencroft assets." "But the contracts," Blackthorne began. "Are forgeries," Adrian cut in coldly. "Crude ones. The notarial seal belongs to a clerk who died 2 years before the supposed signing." The silence that followed strained like a taut violin string. Gwen saw panic creep into the men's eyes where arrogance had been. "Gentlemen," Adrian said, holding the door wide, "I suggest you leave at once. Any further correspondence will pass through my solicitors in Aurendale." Flustered, they fled. Gwen sank into an armchair, the child within her stirring as though sensing the tension. "They'll return," she whispered. "Somehow, they'll return with something worse." Adrian knelt before her, clasping her hands with iron resolve. "No one will endanger you or our child. The ghosts of the past have already done enough harm." But neither saw the swift shadow slip past the window. Blackthorne and Grimby were not finished. Lady Evangeline's vengeance would endure through them, poison seeping into another generation. The winter of 1873 came with unusual fury, storms isolating Hawthorne for weeks. Gwen, heavy with child in her 8th month, felt at once vibrant and exposed. During one such storm, the letters began. The first was delivered by a half-frozen messenger, his lips blue from cold. Adrian read the note in silence, his face hardening into marble. By the fire, Gwen embroidered tiny garments, but she saw his posture stiffen. "What troubles you, my love?" she asked gently, her needle pausing. "Nothing you need concern yourself with," Adrian replied. But she recognized the tone. It was the same as when he had once hidden her aunt's schemes. Setting down her work, Gwen extended her hand. "Adrian, we vowed never to keep secrets. What does the letter say?" Reluctantly, he sat beside her on the velvet sofa and handed her the paper. It was from Lord Marroway, an acquaintance in Aurendale's elite circles. "My dear Adrian," it read, "rumors circulate in the capital. Whispers that Lady Gwen exchanged letters with radicals before her marriage, and that her residence at Hawthorne is tied to plots against the crown. While I place no faith in such tales, others seem inclined to believe them." Gwen felt her blood run cold. The strategy was the same as always: destroy her with lies impossible to disprove. "Blackthorne and Grimby," she murmured. "When they could not ruin us in law, they turned to slander." In the weeks that followed, more letters arrived, each laced with more venom. They accused Gwen of espionage, of seducing noblemen to steal military secrets, of marrying Adrian as part of a conspiracy. The air in Hawthorne thickened with unease. Servants whispered. Merchants grew hesitant. Even the village vicar grew distant. On one storm-lashed night, Gwen felt the first pangs of labor. She had been reading poetry in the library when pain tore through her like lightning. "Adrian!" she cried, her voice echoing the corridors. He came running, still in his riding clothes from the stables. At the sight of her pale face and trembling hands clutching her belly, he understood instantly. "The child," she whispered. "It's coming." The storm outside mirrored the chaos within her body. Contractions struck in relentless waves as Mrs. Helena Grimsby and Aloan Price prepared the chamber. The village doctor was snowbound, leaving only Mrs. Helena's hard-earned experience from countless local births. Through long, agonizing hours, Gwen clung to Adrian's hand as though it were her only anchor. Between cries of pain, his voice reached her, soft, steady, full of love. "No matter what they say of us," he whispered, kissing her sweat-damp brow, "I will shield you and our child from every storm. Our truth is stronger than every lie in the world." When dawn broke over Hawthorne, painting the snow in hues of rose and gold, the first cries of a newborn echoed through its halls. Gwen cradled a flawless little boy in her arms, his dark hair mirroring Adrian's, his eyes shimmering with the promise of her own emerald green. "Thomas," she whispered, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Thomas Whitthorne, after my grandfather." Adrian kissed his wife first, then the tiny brow of his son, feeling in that instant that the world's slanders and persecutions were powerless before the miracle they had wrought together. But beyond the warmth of their chamber, a messenger rode hard through the thawing snow, carrying word of the child's birth to ears awaiting it with sinister anticipation. The campaign to destroy the Whitthornes was entering its final act. The spring of 1873 clothed Hawthorne in deceptive beauty. Gardens flourished under Gwen's care, yet tension charged the air like lightning before a storm. Little Thomas, at 3 months, was the very heart of the house. His crystalline laughter echoed down the corridors, and Gwen never tired of watching Adrian hold their son with reverence, as if carrying the rarest treasure on earth. One May morning, as Gwen nursed Thomas in the rose garden, Mr. Cedric Valour approached, his expression heavy with dread. "Lady Gwen," he said, hesitating. "Officers from Aurendale have arrived. They bear a warrant from the Home Office." Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Searching for what, Mr. Valour?" Documents suggesting treason against the crown." He looked ashamed merely to speak the words. Gwen kissed Thomas's downy head and passed him gently to Aloan Price, who hovered anxiously nearby. "And Lord Adrian?" "He rode to the village for matters concerning the schoolhouse. He will not return before evening." Gwen lifted her chin with quiet resolve. "Then I shall meet them myself." Captain Howick was a grizzled man with weary eyes, flanked by 2 uneasy young soldiers. "Lady Whitthorne," he said, visibly uncomfortable, "I regret the humiliation, but grave accusations have been made. Secret correspondence with foreign agents, conspiracies against national security." "I understand, Captain," Gwen replied with serene dignity. "Search as you must. We have nothing to conceal." For 2 hours they combed every chamber, every drawer, every shelf. Gwen accompanied them in silence, Thomas once more in her arms, enduring the violation with unflinching composure. In Adrian's study, they uncovered what they had clearly been instructed to find: forged letters, crudely mimicking her hand, addressed to French agents and describing troop movements. "These letters," Captain Howick began. "They are not mine," Gwen interjected firmly. "The script may resemble mine, but it is counterfeit. And the ink and paper are nothing I have ever used. Examine them closely, and you will see." The captain hesitated, suspicion warring with intuition. He studied her calm face, the child in her arms, the certainty in her voice. "Lady Whitthorne," he said at last, voice low, "I am bound by duty. These documents constitute evidence of treason. I must take you to Aurendale for questioning." The world tilted, but Thomas's weight grounded her. "Captain, one request." "That depends. My son still nurses. Permit him to accompany me, at least until other arrangements are made." Her voice nearly broke. The officer's stern mask faltered as he gazed at the sleeping infant. For a moment he looked not as a soldier, but as a father. "That can be arranged," he said softly. "But know this, treason is a capital crime." When Adrian returned at nightfall, he found Hawthorne Hollow without its light. Sarah pressed a note into his hands, Gwen's final message. "Do not lose faith in our truth. Love always finds its way home." Adrian clutched the paper, his hands trembling, fury rising within. The world sought to tear away all he loved, but not this time. This time, he would fight with every weapon. In Aurendale's prison, Gwen rocked Thomas gently, singing the lullabies her own mother once whispered. Beyond the walls, Blackthorn and Grimby counted coins, exulting in their cruelest scheme. Yet they had misjudged the strength of a man bent on saving his family, and the bonds of loyalty Gwen had sown through years of kindness. The tower had never known a prisoner like Lady Gwen Whitthorne. Her very presence softened its grimness. Guards greeted her with quiet respect. Even fellow captives spoke of her with reverence. She occupied a modest cell, clean and orderly, her child always in her arms. Thomas seemed to absorb her serenity, seldom crying, as though he understood his own strength was vital. 5 days of interrogation followed, overseen by Lord Ashcombe, a heavy-set, impatient man clearly craving a swift confession. But Gwen dismantled each charge with unwavering clarity, answering with the precision of truth. "Lady Whitthorne," Lord Ashcombe pressed on the 4th day, exasperated. "The evidence is undeniable. These letters were discovered in your home, in your own hand." "In appearance only, my lord," Gwen interrupted softly. With Thomas asleep upon her lap, she requested paper and ink. Before their eyes, she wrote a few lines. The difference between her authentic script and the forgeries was stark. "Furthermore," she continued, "the alleged dates align with times when I was visibly with child confined at Hawthorne. Dozens can testify to my presence." At that moment, the chamber doors burst open. Adrian strode in, Alaric Hartwell at his side, carrying a leather case heavy with documents. "My lord," Adrian declared, his voice commanding, "I bring evidence that will clear my wife completely." Lord Ashcombe scowled. "Lord Whitthorne, this is a military court. There is no precedent." "There is precedent for truth," Adrian cut him off, his gaze never leaving Gwen's. In that glance lay vows of eternal protection. Hartwell opened the case. Inside were photographs, letters, and a trembling man, a clerk from Blackthorne and Grimby's firm. "This witness," Hartwell announced, "confesses to forging the letters at his employer's bidding for a sum of gold. Furthermore, we have proof that Blackthorne and Grimby dealt with French agents. They are the true traitors." The clerk confirmed every word, explaining how he had copied Gwen's script from social letters stolen through aristocratic contacts. "And more," Adrian added, producing another sheet. The so-called intelligence in these forgeries had already been printed in the Times a week before the alleged letters were written. Lord Ashcombe shifted uneasily as the edifice of conspiracy collapsed before him, fragile as a card tower toppled by wind. "And where are Blackthorne and Grimby now?" he demanded. "Arrested in Eldermere, attempting to board a vessel for France with a fortune in gold," Alaric Hartwell replied with grim satisfaction. When Blackthorne and Grimby realized their scheme against the Whitthornes had collapsed, they sought to flee with the wealth they had extorted from families for years. A heavy silence fell. Gwen hugged Thomas closer, tears of relief warming her cheeks. Adrian moved slowly toward her, as though afraid she might vanish if he approached too quickly. "Is it over?" she whispered. "It is finished," Lord Ashcombe confirmed solemnly. "Lady Gwen Whitthorne, on behalf of Her Majesty, I extend apologies for the indignities suffered by your family. All charges are withdrawn. A formal apology will be issued before the Lords." When Gwen rose, carrying her child, and stepped into Adrian's arms, those present witnessed something rare: the triumph of truth over deceit, of love over malice, of dignity over slander. But their greatest victory would be found back at Hawthorne, not merely as survivors of a storm, but as a family tempered in fire and bound by unbreakable love. 5 years later, the summer of 1878 found Hawthorne transformed, a beacon of life and hope, gleaming like a lighthouse on stormy waters. Gwen, now 29, gazed from her favorite window at gardens stretching endlessly under the sun. Thomas, clever and curious at 5, chased butterflies among the rose bushes, his unruly hair bouncing with each leap. Nearby laughed Ileana, 3 years old, her curls like spun honey. Little Edmund, only 1, crawled valiantly across the grass. Yet it was not just her children who filled the grounds with joy. Margaret, Michael, and Sophie, 3 orphan siblings welcomed 2 years before, completed the family that she and Adrian had built with such devotion. Hawthorne echoed with footsteps, giggles, and the music that only true happiness creates. Adrian approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her, his chin resting upon her shoulder. Silver threaded his dark hair now, but his eyes still held the depth that had first captured her heart. "What thoughts claim you, my love?" he murmured, his voice softened by years of shared intimacy. "The school," Gwen answered, leaning into him. "It is nearly finished. Next week, 50 village children will finally receive the education they deserve." The school had been their dream since the earliest days of marriage. Now it stood proud upon the grounds, a red brick building with broad windows and sunlit rooms, where children of every station would learn together. "Mrs. Grimsby is preparing a feast for the opening," Adrian said with a smile, "and Aloan insists on sewing uniforms for them all, though many families could provide their own." "That is our Aloan," Gwen laughed softly, "always mothering the world." For a time they stood watching the children at play, marveling that such peace had grown from such suffering. "Sometimes I still wake," Gwen admitted quietly, "dreaming those dark days have returned, fearing all this is only a fragile dream." Adrian turned her gently, his gaze still able to quicken her heart. "Gwen, you have changed not only my life, but the lives of hundreds. Look around. See how many children have brighter futures because of your courage. See how our love has multiplied." It was true. Hawthorne had become a model for all Whitthorne County. Beyond the school, they had founded a clinic for the poor, workshops for apprentices, and a public library admired across the region. "Evangeline was wrong," Adrian continued, brushing a kiss against her brow. "She believed birth and title defined worth. But you have shown that dignity, kindness, and courage outweigh all the ancient heraldry in the world." That afternoon, as they prepared for supper, Gwen received a letter that stirred her deeply. It was from Lord Pembrokhurst, the judge who had once condemned Lady Evangeline. Dear Lady Whitthorne, it read, I write to tell you your ordeal has inspired lasting change. New laws now protect citizens from false accusations and require stricter evidence before trial. Your suffering was not in vain. Thousands will be safeguarded by your courage in pursuit of truth. That night, when the children lay asleep, Gwen and Adrian walked beneath a full moon. The roses she had planted in her earliest days at Hawthorne now stretched in fragrant rows to the horizon. Do you regret anything? Adrian asked, twining his fingers with hers. By the rose garden, the place of their first true closeness, Gwen paused. She thought of the lies, the prison, the storms of slander and fear. And she thought of what they had gained, an unbreakable love, a flourishing family, the power to turn pain into hope. None, she said with certainty. Every tear, every night of terror, every doubt, it was all worth it. Worth it to stand here, in this garden, with this family, with this love. Adrian kissed her under the ancient stars, their witness to countless loves. His kiss promised every tomorrow they would face, every storm they would endure, every garden they would plant. When they parted, Gwen looked once more at Hawthorne Keep, its windows aglow with life. It was more than a home. It was proof that love can bloom even in the harshest soil, and that human dignity surpasses all injustice. Let's go home, she whispered, and in those words lay the magic of a life built on love, courage, and eternal hope. In the garden, the roses breathed their fragrance into the night breeze, whispering to generations yet to come the story of Gwen and Adrian Whitthorne, a story that proved once more that true love will always find a way to bloom.